I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head,
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, this is a fact-driven channel. We don't only deal with facts, because if you just dealt with facts, it would be very dry and very limited. I mean, even courtrooms take the facts and they've got to interpret them. So it's not just fact-driven, although it certainly isn't speculation-driven either. I must say, in regard to that, it was a little reckless and rash to prognosticate on, in terms of my previous video, on what I was talking about actually prior to the results of the post-mortem being released. They have now been released, and they do support the contention I've kind of been making all along, which I think vindicates the critical thinking that's part of it. But you could just as easily have had a situation where something random could have happened and there was some sort of serious injury, a bullet wound, some kind of blunt force trauma, something like that. And so one does need to be careful rushing to judgment, although I don't think that is what we did here. We also have updated CCTV of Gaynor heading to and entering the park at around 4:04 p.m. So this is actually the last picture, the last footage of Gaynor. And just once again, it's yet another portrait of this woman, of this 55-year-old woman in the last moments of her life. And it is sad to watch. One can almost feel the desolation. And you know how post-mortems work, how autopsies work, is they look for superficial and surface injuries to the body. Well, if only they could do the same to the mind, show the trauma, show the heartache. And that's, of course, something that they can't do. In any event, before we get to the rest of this analysis, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please do. For the many new British subscribers, I do cover other British cases such as the Madeleine McCann case. I've written quite a few books on that case, but also American cases. I think you might find the disappearance of Suzanne Morphew on Mother's Day also quite interesting. And I'll be covering those cases in probably the next two videos following this one. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, bearing in mind I'm one of those creators that doesn't really do a lot of live streams. And let's get started. So some headlines indicate that Gaynor's husband Clive is lost, and our sympathies and our condolences certainly go to him and to the family. But apparently her husband is lost. He can't understand what is happening. I'm sorry, but I find it such an ironic statement, given that there's been a search for a missing person who got lost in some way, who got lost in this river, who we couldn't find, and perhaps couldn't understand what was happening to her. We couldn't understand what was happening to her, but perhaps she couldn't either. Perhaps she got lost in the labyrinth of emotions and one's own life journey. And I have to say, based on the comments that I'm reading, many people feel the same way as her second husband. They don't have a clue. Like, why did this happen? But there are some clues. There seems to be a small ripple in the narrative, certainly as it appears in the Daily Mail. Quote, Julie Muddle, who is married to Mrs. Lord's first husband, Paul, said, my stepson told me Gaynor was the best she had been for a long time. She loved her job. She absolutely loved it. She was making new friends, and she was the happiest she'd been for a long time. Now, what is so strange with that statement is if you read between the lines, it almost becomes an inversion of itself. Because from this we can extrapolate that Gaynor was likely in a second marriage. That's not so unusual. But the statement saying she was the happiest she'd been for a long time suggests actually that she was unhappy for a long time, that she'd reached this sort of finish line. She'd reached this milestone of happiness, of a peak in happiness after perhaps some kind of struggle. And also saying that she was the happiest she'd been and made new friends. And then simply contrasting those words almost as a voiceover with the new CCTV, that dreary place where the sun is setting and in front of her is a watery grave that she's walking with determination towards. She's walking directly towards that watery grave. And to say that, well, this is a woman that was the happiest she'd been, and she had lots of friends. You know, what is also apparent on the CCTV is she's never on her phone. She's not trying to reach out to anyone after her brief call to Julie Butcher. And I think that indicates she wasn't terribly happy. I mean, is this incident proof just on this day, on this afternoon, when she leaves work early without telling anyone, without getting permission, and then doesn't call anyone either, and spends basically that entire afternoon by herself? Is that a little kind of fragment of the happiest time of her life? Someone who's the happiest she'd been for a long time? I wouldn't say so. Let me reiterate, leaving work early to only to wander into a park alone and then disappear is hardly the happily after sentiment, you know, that she was the happiest she'd been for a long time. If we could speak to Gaynor right now, if we could nudge her on the shoulder and say, how were you feeling? You know, people want to know. I wouldn't be surprised if she said that she was the unhappiest she'd ever been. Maybe not in general, but perhaps because of something specific. We know on the day that she went missing, or the day before, she didn't say how happy she was feeling. She said words to the effect that the person she was talking to, a salesman, thought that she was struggling with anxiety. And she was saying that she felt funny and a bit off. She wasn't saying how happy she was. And I think part of thinking critically, and we say this so often, but it needs to be said, because people aren't thinking critically. Part of thinking critically is being brave enough to simply open that door and be curious and say it's okay to be curious in this area, and also open-minded in this area. Curious and open-minded about things that may not have been so great. And if we can do that about somebody else, maybe we can do that about ourselves. What's not so great in that person's life, or what's not so great in my life? Where is there room for improvement? Rather than insisting she was happy and that her life was perfect, rather than insisting that your life is happy, completely happy and completely perfect, maybe there are times where you can acknowledge that it isn't. And that's okay. Because this whole thing where you insist that everything is wonderful is the narrative equivalent of Instagrams, showing off the good but hiding the not so good. Projecting strength in the sense that, oh, that's attractive, someone will like me, but hiding away the weakness, which eventually does show through. Someone was saying TCRS, True Crime Rocket Science, is a true crime channel, and so you shouldn't even be covering this case. There's no foul play, no crime, and that's been confirmed. Well, true crime is also about discerning the difference between a crime and an accident and something else. It's about psychology, it's about motive, it's about following the evidence. It's about understanding a person and understanding their identity. It seems to me, and I apologize if this seems patronizing, but it seems to me, based on a lot of ignorant commentary, that a lot of help is needed, not only in telling the difference between one reality and another, meaning a foul play scenario and something else, but simply facing it. People seem to struggle to tell the difference between an accident and foul play. And, there's some very important cases where that's the case. In the John Benet Ramsey case, was it foul play or an accident? Well, I believe John Benet was killed in an accident. I believe Madeleine McCann died in an accident. Is the Rush incident with Alec Baldwin an accident or foul play or something in between? All of that takes discernment. Oscar Pistorius case, deliberate action, foul play or something in between. It takes discernment to see the actual reality. I also want to thank the many of you who've shared your deepest, very deeply personal and tragic stories of loved ones you've lost, often in similar ways to Gaynor. You guys get it, and I think you guys understand why acknowledging that things aren't so great is a very great challenge, especially in an artificial world and especially during the festive season when everyone's supposed to be happy. We live in a fake society that's all about exaggerating our successes and inflating the wonderful fairy tales we're living. We're good at that, but we are ill-equipped to know what to do or where to turn to when we find ourselves in a nightmare. And like Gaynor, having to face the cold and encroaching darkness all alone. And so when we're able to talk about stories like this openly, honestly, authentically, then we make it easier for other people who are feeling vulnerable and afraid and anxious to come out of their corners and talk about it and feel the embrace of others and, be pulled out of those dark holes that they find themselves in. And one of the ways for that to happen is for them to reach out and also for others to reach out to them. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.